Long before Zeus ruled from the heights of Mount Olympus, long before the great temples of Greece were built, long before heroes like Heracles, Perseus, and Odysseus became legends, there was another world. A world ruled by older gods. A world where the mountains were still young, where the seas were still being divided, and where the order of the universe had not yet been established. There were no Olympian gods sitting upon their thrones. There was no Zeus holding his thunderbolt. There was no Poseidon ruling the seas. There was no Hades ruling the realm of the dead. Instead, the universe belonged to an older generation, the Titans. And among them was a powerful god named Cronus. His story began long before he became a ruler. It began at the beginning of the world itself. The ancient Greeks imagined that the universe had not always existed in the form they knew. There had been no cities, no oceans filled with ships, no forests, no people, no gods walking among mountains. There was only a mysterious beginning. The Greeks called it chaos. Chaos was not necessarily a monster or a god in the way later generations imagined their gods. It was more like an immense, primordial state, a beginning, a vast opening from which the earliest forces of existence emerged. From this ancient beginning came Gaia, the earth. Gaia was not simply a goddess who lived upon the earth. She was the earth itself. The mountains were part of her. The valleys were part of her. The forests, the plains, and the deep foundations of the world belonged to her. Gaia became one of the first great powers of the universe, and from her came other ancient beings. Among them was Uranus, the sky. Uranus stretched above Gaia like an endless celestial covering. Together, earth and sky became the ancestors of a new generation of divine beings, the Titans. They were enormous primordial gods, older than the Olympians and connected to the fundamental forces of the universe. There were many of them. Oceanus, associated with the great cosmic river that was believed to surround the world. Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, and among them, Cronus. Cronus was the youngest of the male Titans, but being the youngest did not make him weak. He was ambitious, he was intelligent, and he was willing to challenge the power that stood above him. Because Uranus was not a gentle ruler, he feared his own children. Gaia had given birth to beings of tremendous power, and Uranus became afraid that one day they might overthrow him. So he tried to prevent them from ever reaching the world. Some of Gaia's children were pushed into the depths of the earth. Others were confined away from the light. Gaia suffered because of this. The earth carried within itself children who were unable to live freely. Her anger grew. Eventually, Gaia decided that Uranus had to be stopped. She created a great sickle, a weapon made for one purpose: to overthrow the sky. She asked her children who among them would be brave enough to challenge their father. One by one, they remained silent. The task was terrifying. Uranus was the ruler of the heavens. He was ancient. He was powerful. To attack him meant challenging the order of the universe itself. But one Titan accepted: Cronus, the youngest. He agreed to stand against his father, and so Gaia gave Cronus the sickle. The plan was simple. When Uranus came to Gaia, Cronus would attack. The moment arrived. The ancient sky descended toward the earth, and Cronus struck. The old order was broken. Uranus was overthrown. Cronus had defeated his father. The Titan now stood above the other gods. He had achieved what no one else had dared to attempt. He had taken the throne of the universe. The age of Uranus was over. The age of Cronus had begun. And for a time, the world seemed peaceful. Cronus ruled with the Titans around him. The universe was divided among ancient divine powers. The earth remained beneath them. The heavens stretched above them. The seas moved through the world, and the new ruler sat at the center of this ancient order. But Cronus carried something with him from the moment he took power: fear. He had overthrown his father, and because he had overthrown his father, he knew exactly what was possible. He knew that power could change hands. He knew that a child could one day become stronger than a parent, and he remembered something else: a prophecy, a warning that had come from the divine order he had replaced. Cronus would not rule forever. One of his own children would eventually overthrow him. The prophecy frightened him. At first, Cronus continued ruling. He married his sister Rhea. Together, they became parents. Their children belonged to the next generation of gods. The first was Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. Each child represented another part of the divine world that would eventually come to shape Greek mythology. But Cronus could not look at them simply as children. He saw the prophecy. Every newborn child reminded him of the fate he feared. Every time Rhea gave birth, Cronus remembered his father's downfall. He remembered Uranus. He remembered how easily power had changed hands. And he became desperate to prevent history from repeating itself. So Cronus made a terrible decision. He swallowed his children, one by one. When Hestia was born, Cronus swallowed her. When Demeter was born, he swallowed her. Then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. The children were not destroyed. They remained alive within him, but they were trapped. Rhea watched helplessly. She was their mother. She had carried them. She had given birth to them. And now she watched Cronus take them away. The fear inside her grew with every birth. She knew that Cronus was acting because of prophecy, but she could not accept that her children should disappear simply because their father was afraid of them. Then Rhea became pregnant once again. This time, the child was Zeus. And Rhea knew that something had to change. She could not allow Cronus to swallow another child. She could not watch another newborn disappear into the body of the god who feared him. So Rhea searched for a way to protect her final child. She needed somewhere Cronus could not find him, somewhere hidden, somewhere far from the palace of the Titans, somewhere protected by the earth itself. According to the ancient tradition, Rhea traveled to the island of Crete. There Zeus was born. The child who would one day rule the gods entered the world in secrecy. There were no great temples, no armies, no crowds, no thunderbolts. Zeus began life as a hidden infant, a vulnerable child, a child whose father wanted him dead. Rhea wrapped the newborn Zeus. She carried him away, and instead of giving him to Cronus, she gave Cronus something else, a deception. She wrapped a stone in cloth. She made it resemble a newborn child. Then she brought it before Cronus. He did not investigate. He did not question her. His fear was stronger than his curiosity. He believed the child was Zeus, and he swallowed the stone. Cronus thought the prophecy had been defeated. He believed that his final child was gone. But Zeus was alive, hidden away in Crete. There, his childhood began. The Greeks told different stories about how Zeus was protected. One tradition placed him in a cave on Mount Ida. Another associated his childhood with the sacred mountain itself. The stories described beings who helped conceal him. The curettes, armed divine attendants, were said to have made enormous noise around the cave. They clashed their weapons together. They danced. They shouted. They created such a disturbance that the cries of the infant Zeus could not be heard. Because if Cronus discovered that the child was alive, he would come for him. So Zeus grew in secret, away from the throne, away from the Titan court. away from the eyes of his father. He was fed and protected. Some traditions said he was nourished by the divine goat Amalthea. Others described bees bringing him honey. The details changed from one ancient story to another, but the central idea remained the same. Zeus survived because others protected him. The future king of the gods began his life not as a conqueror, but as a hidden child. Meanwhile, Cronus continued to rule. He believed that the danger was gone. His children were trapped inside him. His youngest son was dead. The prophecy had been defeated. At least, that was what he believed. Years passed. Zeus grew. He became stronger. He learned about the world. He learned about the Titans. He learned about his father. And eventually, he learned the truth. His brothers and sisters were still alive. They were trapped inside Cronus. Zeus could not simply ignore them. He understood that his destiny was connected to theirs. If he wanted freedom, they would need freedom too. If he wanted to overthrow Cronus, he would need allies. And if the prophecy was ever going to be fulfilled, the hidden child would have to reveal himself. But Zeus could not attack Cronus immediately. Cronus was still immensely powerful. The Titans controlled the universe. They had ruled for generations. Zeus had only recently grown into his strength. He needed a plan, so Zeus left Crete. He entered the world of the Titans, and according to the ancient tradition, he eventually found a way to approach Cronus without immediately revealing who he was. The first step was to make Cronus release the children he had swallowed. A potion was prepared. Cronus drank it, and the impossible began. The first child came back, Hestia, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. One after another, the children of Cronus emerged. They had been trapped inside him for years. Now they stood together, alive and grown. The children Cronus had feared were no longer helpless infants. They were divine beings, and now they knew what their father had done. They had been imprisoned because of his fear. They had been denied the world outside, and they had been saved by the youngest among them, Zeus. For the first time, the new generation of gods stood together. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, Hera, Demeter, Hestia, and they faced the old order, the Titans. The world was about to change, but Cronus did not surrender his throne peacefully. He understood what Zeus intended. The prophecy had come true. The child he believed he had swallowed was alive. The child he had tried to destroy had returned, and now that child had gathered the very gods Cronus had feared. The Titan king called upon his allies. The Titans prepared for war. Zeus prepared as well. But Zeus understood something important. The Titans were powerful. If he fought them alone, he might lose. He needed more allies. He needed weapons. He needed forces capable of matching the ancient power of Cronus. And this was when Zeus turned toward beings whom the Titans had imprisoned long before, the Cyclopes, the ancient one-eyed beings, and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed ones. These beings had been imprisoned because the older gods feared their power. Zeus freed them, and they became his allies. The Cyclopes were grateful. They possessed extraordinary skill. They became craftsmen for the new gods, and they created weapons that would become symbols of divine power. For Zeus, the thunderbolt. For Poseidon, the mighty trident. For Hades, the helmet of invisibility. These were not ordinary weapons. They represented the powers that would eventually define the three brothers. Zeus would command the sky. Poseidon would command the sea. Hades would rule the realm beneath the earth. But first, they had to win. The two generations prepared for war. The Titans gathered on one side, the younger gods gathered on the other, and somewhere between them stood the ancient world itself. Mountains, forests, seas, rivers, the earth. Everything was about to become a battlefield. The conflict would not last a single day. It would continue for years. The gods would fight from the mountains. The Titans would fight from their strongholds. Thunder would cross the sky. Rocks would fall from the heavens. The earth itself would shake. The ancient Greeks called this great conflict the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, and it would determine who would rule the universe. For Zeus, the battle was more than a struggle for power. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy. It was the liberation of his family. It was the destruction of the order created by his father, and it was the beginning of a new age, an age that would eventually be known as the age of the Olympian gods. But Zeus did not yet know whether he would survive. The Titans were ancient. They were powerful. They had ruled for generations. And now, the youngest generation of gods was challenging them. The war was about to begin. The mountains would shake. The heavens would darken. And the thunderbolt of Zeus would soon become one of the most feared weapons in all of mythology. The hidden child of Crete was no longer hiding. He was ready to claim his destiny. And the first great war of the gods was about to begin. The war had not yet begun, but the pieces were already in place. On one side stood Cronus, the ruler of the Titans. On the other stood Zeus, the child who had escaped the fate that his father had tried to give him. Between them stood an entire generation of gods, the old order and the new. For years, Cronus had believed that he had defeated the prophecy. He had swallowed his children. He had taken the throne from Uranus. He had become ruler of the universe, and he believed that nothing could take that power away from him. But Cronus had made one mistake. He had underestimated the child he believed was dead. Zeus had survived. He had grown in secret, and now he was ready to return. The story of Zeus's rise was not simply the story of a powerful god becoming king. It was the story of a child who grew up knowing that his father would destroy him if he were discovered. It was the story of a family divided by fear, and it was the beginning of a struggle that would reshape the universe. Long before Zeus became the ruler of Mount Olympus, he was simply a hidden child in a cave. The island of Crete became his refuge. Far away from the palace of Cronus, Zeus grew beneath the protection of those who believed that his survival mattered. The mountains surrounded him. The forests covered the slopes. The sea stretched around the island, and above it all, the sky moved slowly through the seasons. Zeus grew stronger. He was no longer the helpless infant Rhea had carried away. The child became a boy. The boy became a young god, and eventually, Zeus became powerful enough to begin thinking about the future. But there was something he could never forget: his brothers and sisters. They were still trapped inside Cronus. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, they had been swallowed by their own father before they could experience the world. They had never walked beneath the sun. They had never seen the mountains. They had never known freedom. Zeus knew that he could not simply become powerful and leave them behind. If he wanted to become the ruler of the gods, he first had to free the gods who had been imprisoned. So Zeus began preparing. The exact details of his preparation were told differently by different ancient writers. The mythology of Greece was never one single story written by one person at one moment. It developed across centuries. Poets told stories. Priests preserved traditions. Different cities worshipped different gods. And different generations added their own details. But the central story remained. Zeus grew, and Cronus became vulnerable. Eventually, Zeus found a way to return to the world ruled by his father. He did not simply walk into the palace carrying a thunderbolt. He understood that he needed intelligence, the same quality that would later make him one of the most successful rulers among the gods. He needed to make Cronus lower his guard, and he needed to find a way to reverse the terrible act that had trapped his brothers and sisters. A plan was created. Cronus would be given something that would force him to release what he had swallowed. The Titan King drank, and then the impossible happened. His first child emerged, Hestia. She returned to the world. Then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. One after another, the children of Cronus were released. The ancient stories sometimes describe them as being reborn from Cronus. Other traditions suggest that they emerged because of a divine potion or substance, but the meaning was the same. The children who had been swallowed were free, and standing among them was Zeus, the youngest, the hidden one, the child who had escaped. For the first time, the 6 siblings stood together. The old generation had ruled for ages. Now the new generation had gathered, and they had a reason to fight. Cronus had taken everything from them. He had imprisoned them because he feared a prophecy. He had tried to prevent the future, but by trying to stop the future, he had created the very rebellion he feared. Zeus looked at his siblings. Poseidon was powerful. Hades was serious and mysterious. Hera carried the strength of a goddess who would one day become queen. Demeter represented the fertility of the earth. Hestia represented the sacred fire of the household. They were different, but they had one thing in common. They were children of Cronus, and they had been denied their lives. Now they wanted freedom. Cronus knew what was happening. He realized that the child he had tried to destroy had survived. The prophecy had not been defeated. It had only been delayed. The Titan King gathered his allies. The Titans prepared for war, and Zeus understood that he needed more than courage. He needed an army. The Titans had ruled for generations. Their strength was enormous. They had their own allies. They controlled powerful regions of the cosmos. If Zeus and his siblings attacked without preparation, they could be destroyed. So Zeus looked toward the ancient beings whom the Titans had imprisoned, the Cyclopes. These beings had existed long before the Olympians. They were powerful craftsmen. Their names were associated with tremendous skill and supernatural strength. The Titans had feared them, so they had been locked away. Zeus freed them, and in return, the Cyclopes became his allies. They understood what Zeus was trying to accomplish. They had been imprisoned by the old order. Now the new generation was offering them freedom. The Cyclopes accepted, and they gave Zeus something that would change the balance of power: a weapon, the thunderbolt, the symbol that would eventually become inseparable from Zeus himself. The thunderbolt represented the power of the sky. Lightning, storms, heavenly fire, the force that could appear in an instant and split the darkness. For Poseidon, the Cyclopes created the trident, a weapon that represented the power of the sea. For Hades, they created the helmet of invisibility, a weapon that could hide its wearer from sight. The 3 brothers now possessed powers that reflected their future domains, but they were not yet rulers. They had to win the war, and the war was going to be enormous. The conflict between the Titans and the younger gods became known as the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. It was not a war fought like human wars. There were no ordinary armies marching across fields. The battlefield was the universe itself. Mountains became strongholds. The sky became a battlefield. The earth shook beneath the fighting. The seas rose. Lightning crossed the heavens. The ancient powers of creation collided with one another. The Titans fought from Mount Olympus. Zeus and his allies gathered on Mount Olympus. The two mountains became symbols of the two generations. Olympus represented the old order. Olympus represented the new. The war began. At first, neither side could defeat the other. The Titans were immensely powerful. They had experience. They had ruled the universe for generations. They knew the ancient powers. They knew how to fight. Zeus and his siblings were powerful as well, but they were still the younger generation. They needed every advantage they could find. The battles continued. Years passed. The universe seemed trapped in conflict. The Titans would attack. The Olympians would respond. The earth would tremble. The heavens would roar. And still neither side could claim complete victory. Zeus began to realize that simply fighting harder would not be enough. He needed more allies. He needed the beings who had been imprisoned even deeper than the Cyclopes. The Hecatoncheires, the hundred-handed ones. They were among the most terrifying beings of ancient mythology. Each possessed enormous strength. Each had 100 hands. Their power was almost impossible to imagine, and the Titans had kept them imprisoned because they feared what such creatures might do if they were free. Zeus descended into the depths. He found them, and he released them. The hundred-handed ones joined him. Their arrival changed the war. They could hurl enormous rocks with tremendous force. They could attack from many directions at once. They became living weapons against the Titans. The balance began to shift. Zeus raised his thunderbolt. Lightning filled the sky. The sound of thunder rolled across the mountains. Poseidon attacked with his trident. Hades used his helmet of invisibility. The Cyclopes fought beside them. The hundred-handed ones hurled stones. The Titans resisted. But slowly, the old order began to collapse. The war reached its final stage. The younger gods attacked with everything they possessed. The Titans fought desperately, but they could not stop the new generation. Eventually, the Olympians won. The Titans were defeated. Some were imprisoned in Tartarus, the deepest region of the underworld. Others were given different fates depending on the ancient tradition, but the important thing was that Cronus had lost. The ruler who had feared being overthrown had finally been overthrown. The prophecy had come true. The child he had tried to swallow had become the god who defeated him. The universe had entered a new age, but Zeus had not yet become the unquestioned king. Winning the war was only the beginning. The defeated Titans had left behind a universe that still needed to be organized. The gods now had to decide who would control what. The three brothers stood together: Zeus, Poseidon, Hades. They had survived the war. They had defeated their father. But now came a question that would determine the structure of the world. Who would rule the sky? Who would rule the sea? Who would rule the realm of the dead? The answer would come through a drawing of lots. The three brothers would divide the universe between themselves. Zeus received the sky. Poseidon received the sea. Hades received the underworld. The earth itself remained a shared domain, but Zeus held the highest position among them. He became ruler of the gods. The throne of the universe now belonged to him. The child who had once been hidden in a cave was now the most powerful Olympian. Yet his journey was not finished, because being powerful was not the same as being secure. There were still ancient forces that could challenge him. There were still creatures born from the old world. There were still prophecies. There were still conflicts. And perhaps most importantly, there were still questions about what kind of ruler Zeus would become. Would he repeat the mistakes of Cronus? Would he rule through fear? Would he destroy anyone who threatened him? Or would he create a new order, The ancient myths would answer those questions through countless stories. But before Zeus became the familiar god of thunder and Olympus, he had one more great challenge. The earth itself would rise against the Olympians. A monstrous force would be born. The giants would challenge the gods. And Zeus would discover that becoming king was much easier than remaining king. The new ruler of Olympus stood upon his throne. The storm clouds gathered above the mountains. The thunderbolt rested in his hand. The ancient world had changed. Cronus was gone. The Titans had fallen. The Olympians had won. But the age of Zeus had only just begun. And somewhere beneath the mountains, something was waiting. Something older than kings. Something powerful enough to challenge the new gods. The battle for the throne was over. The battle to keep it was about to begin. The war was over. For the first time since the beginning of the world, the old order had fallen. Cronus was no longer ruler. The Titans no longer commanded the heavens. The ancient throne had passed into the hands of a younger generation. And at the center of this new order stood Zeus. The child who had once been hidden in a cave on Crete now sat upon the throne of Olympus. His father had tried to prevent his birth. His brothers and sisters had been swallowed. The Titans had fought to preserve their ancient rule, and yet none of it had been enough. Zeus had survived. His family had been freed, and the Olympians had won. But victory did not mean that the universe had suddenly become peaceful. The world was still filled with ancient powers. The Titans had been defeated, but the forces that had existed before Zeus were not simply erased. The earth still remembered. The mountains still stood. The seas still moved. The oldest powers of creation still existed beneath the surface of the new divine order. And Zeus was about to discover that becoming king was only the beginning. He had won his throne. Now he had to defend it. The first task was to establish order. The universe had been divided among the three brothers. Zeus received the sky. Poseidon received the sea. Hades received the realm of the dead. The earth remained a shared domain. This division created the basic structure of the world that would appear again and again in Greek mythology. Above was Zeus, below the earth was Hades, and around the world flowed the domain of Poseidon. Each brother had his own power. Each had his own kingdom, and each was independent in his own realm. But Zeus held a special position. He was the ruler of the gods. The Olympians gathered around him: Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Hestia, Hades, although associated with the underworld rather than Mount Olympus itself. And later, other gods would join the Olympian order: Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Hermes, Hephaestus, Aphrodite. The great divine family would grow, but Zeus was at its center. The new order was not simply about strength. It was about laws, promises, hospitality, oaths, justice, and the relationship between gods and mortals. Zeus became associated with all of these things. He was the god of the sky and thunder, but he was also associated with authority, with kingship, with the protection of guests and strangers, with sacred promises. The ancient Greeks believed that a world without order could quickly return to chaos. Cronus had ruled through fear of prophecy. Zeus wanted to establish something different. At least, that was the ideal. But even the gods were not free from conflict. The Olympians themselves argued. They competed. They became jealous. They disagreed. They loved. They betrayed. They made promises and sometimes broke them. The new world was not perfect. It was simply different. And beneath the surface, Gaia remained angry. The earth had once helped Zeus. She had helped overthrow Uranus. She had helped preserve the ancient order. But now her children, the Titans, were imprisoned. The old generation had been defeated, and Gaia did not accept this quietly. The ancient mother of the gods began to turn against Zeus. According to the myths, she gave birth to another generation of beings, the giants. They were not ordinary giants. They were powerful divine creatures connected to the ancient earth. Their purpose was to challenge the Olympians. The conflict became known as the Titanomachy, the War of the Giants. The giants rose against Olympus. The new gods had defeated the Titans. Now they faced another threat from the ancient world. But there was a difference. The giants were powerful. They were enormous. They possessed supernatural strength. Yet the gods had something the giants lacked: unity. The Olympians could fight together. And Zeus had learned from the Titan War. He knew that overwhelming strength alone was not always enough. He needed allies, he needed strategy, and he needed to understand the nature of the enemy. The giants rose from the earth. They challenged the authority of Zeus. Mountains shook beneath their footsteps. The sky darkened. The ancient world seemed to rise once again against the new order. The gods prepared for battle. Zeus took his place among them. His thunderbolt filled the sky. Lightning crossed the clouds. Thunder rolled over the mountains. Poseidon stood ready with his trident. Athena prepared for battle. Ares carried his weapons. Apollo and Artemis prepared their bows. The other gods gathered. The war began. The giants attacked. They hurled enormous stones. They tore trees from the earth. They challenged the gods with tremendous force. The Olympians fought back. Thunder struck. Lightning illuminated the battlefield. The sea rose beneath Poseidon's command. The earth shook. The mountains seemed to move. For a time, neither side could completely defeat the other. Then Zeus discovered something important. The giants could not be defeated by the gods alone. There was an ancient rule, a prophecy. The giants could only be defeated with the help of a mortal. This was a problem. The gods were immortal. Mortals were fragile. How could a mortal possibly help defeat beings powerful enough to challenge the Olympians? The answer would come through one of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology, Heracles. But Heracles had not yet become the legendary hero remembered by later generations. His story had not yet begun. The gods needed him. And Zeus understood that sometimes the greatest power in the world did not come from immortality. It came from the ability to act despite knowing that life was temporary. The giants continued their assault. One of the most famous battles involved the giant Porphyrion. He challenged Zeus himself. Porphyrion was powerful. He stood against the king of the gods. The battle became a symbol of the struggle between the ancient forces and the new Olympian order. Zeus attacked with his thunderbolt. The sky exploded with light. The giant resisted. Then another force entered the battle, Heracles. The mortal hero raised his bow. He fired. The arrow struck. The combined power of Zeus and Heracles overwhelmed the giant. The Olympians had discovered the secret. The gods could fight. But sometimes they needed mortals to finish what they began. The war continued. Giant after giant fell. The Olympians fought across the mountains. The earth shook. The sea churned. The sky became filled with smoke and fire. Athena fought with extraordinary strength. Poseidon attacked from the sea. Zeus continued to unleash thunder. Heracles moved among the battlefield, striking the giants, who had already been weakened by the gods. Eventually, the rebellion collapsed. The giants were defeated. The Olympians remained, and Zeus's position became stronger than ever. The Titanomachy had established the Olympians. The Gigantomachy had defended them. The new divine order had survived its first great challenges. But Zeus had learned something. A king could not simply win once. He had to maintain order. There would always be forces that wanted to challenge authority. There would always be creatures that believed the old world could return. There would always be someone who thought the throne should belong to them. And Zeus himself was not immune to prophecy. In fact, he would eventually discover that even the king of the gods could fear what the future might bring. But before that, the universe began to settle. The gods established their homes on Mount Olympus. The mountain became the symbolic center of the divine world. From its heights, the gods could look down upon the mortal lands. Clouds surrounded the peaks. The air was clear and bright. Golden halls were imagined among the mountains. The gods gathered around Zeus. They feasted. They drank nectar. They ate ambrosia. They argued. They celebrated victories. They watched humanity below. Olympus became more than a mountain. It became a symbol, a place where gods lived above the ordinary world. And Zeus sat at the center of it. But the relationship between Zeus and the other gods was complicated. He was their king, yet he was also their brother. Hera was both his sister and his wife. Poseidon was his brother. Hades was his brother. Demeter was his sister. Hestia was his sister. The divine family was tightly connected. And like every family, it was filled with disagreements. Zeus could command, but he could not always force the others to agree. Sometimes Hera challenged him. Sometimes Poseidon opposed him. Athena would later become one of his closest allies. Apollo and Artemis would have their own independent powers. The gods had their own personalities, their own desires, their own loyalties. This made Olympus less like a perfect kingdom and more like a powerful divine household. Zeus was the ruler, but he was constantly surrounded by other powerful beings. And this was important, because the myths of Zeus were not simply stories about a god sitting on a throne. They were stories about power, about responsibility, about family, about desire, and about the consequences of using authority. The ancient Greeks did not imagine their gods as perfect beings. The gods were immortal, but they were not always wise. They could become angry. They could become jealous. They could make mistakes. They could fall in love. They could be cruel. They could also be generous. The stories of Zeus would eventually explore every one of these sides. But before Zeus became the complicated ruler remembered in later mythology, there was another great enemy waiting: Typhon. If the Titans represented the old generation, and the giants represented the rebellious earth, Typhon represented something even more terrifying: a force of chaos itself. Gaia had not forgotten the defeat of her children, and according to one tradition, she joined with Tartarus to produce Typhon. The creature was described as enormous beyond imagination. His body stretched across the world. His head reached toward the heavens. His power was so great that even the gods feared him. Typhon was not simply another monster. He was a challenge to Zeus's entire reign. When Typhon appeared, the gods were terrified. Some fled. Some hid. Some transformed themselves into animals. Zeus remained. He understood what this meant. The universe had survived the Titans. It had survived the giants. Now it faced a creature powerful enough to threaten the king of the gods himself. Typhon attacked. The mountains shook. The heavens darkened. The storm became violent. Zeus raised his thunderbolt. Lightning struck the creature. The battle became enormous. It was not a fight that could take place in a single valley. The two powers clashed across the landscape. Thunder against monstrous strength, sky against earth, order against chaos. Typhon fought with tremendous power. For a moment, Zeus was overwhelmed. Some traditions say that Typhon managed to defeat him temporarily, but Zeus recovered. He returned with his thunderbolt. Again and again, lightning struck. The battle continued. Eventually, Zeus defeated Typhon. The monster was buried beneath the earth. Some traditions associated him with Mount Etna. The ancient Greeks imagined that volcanic eruptions could be connected to the imprisoned monster. When the mountain erupted, perhaps Typhon was still struggling beneath it. The story gave natural violence a mythological explanation. The earth itself could seem alive. The mountains could seem angry. The sky could seem to speak through thunder. And Zeus stood above all of it. The king of the gods had survived. The Titans were defeated. The giants were defeated. Typhon was defeated. Typhon was defeated. The Olympian order was now secure, at least for a time. Zeus had become the unquestioned ruler of the divine world. But now came a different challenge. He had to rule the mortal world, and humanity itself was still very young. The ancient Greeks told many stories about how humans came into existence. Some traditions connected humanity with Prometheus. Prometheus was a Titan. Unlike many of his fellow Titans, he had sided with Zeus during the great conflict. He was intelligent, clever, and deeply interested in mortals. Prometheus looked at humanity and saw weakness. Mortals were fragile. They had no claws, no great strength, no natural weapons. They were exposed to the cold. They were vulnerable to animals. They could not compete with the gods. But Prometheus believed that they could become more. He wanted to help them, and eventually, he gave humanity something incredibly valuable: fire. Fire changed everything. With fire, humans could survive cold nights. They could cook food. They could work metal. They could create tools. They could build. They could develop. They could transform their world. But Zeus did not approve. Fire belonged to the gods. Prometheus had crossed a boundary. He had given mortals a power that Zeus believed should remain divine. And now Zeus had to decide what to do. The king of the gods was about to face one of the most famous rebellions in Greek mythology. Prometheus had already helped Zeus against the Titans, but his sympathy for humanity would eventually place him against the very god he had helped establish. The conflict would lead to punishment. It would lead to sacrifice. It would lead to Pandora, and it would shape the relationship between gods and mortals. Zeus had won the throne. He had defeated the ancient powers. He had established Olympus. But ruling the universe would prove much more complicated than winning a war, because enemies were not always monsters. Sometimes they were those who loved humanity. Sometimes they were members of his own family. Sometimes they were the people closest to the throne. And sometimes, the greatest challenge to a ruler came from the ruler himself. Zeus looked down from Olympus. The mortal world stretched below. Forests, rivers, mountains, villages, early human settlements, small fires glowing in the darkness. The world was changing. Humans were learning. They were building. They were becoming more independent. And Zeus was about to decide what place humanity would have in his new universe. The age of Cronus had ended. The age of Zeus had begun. But the stories of the king of the gods were only beginning. The thunderbolt had secured his throne. Now his decisions would shape the lives of gods and mortals alike. And among those decisions would be one that would change humanity forever. The story of Prometheus was waiting. And with it would come one of the most famous creations in Greek mythology, Pandora, the first woman, the box, and the story of how hope remained in the world after everything else had escaped. The war was over. The Titans had fallen. The giants had been defeated. Typhon had been buried beneath the earth, and Zeus now ruled from the heights of Olympus. For the first time, the universe appeared to have a stable order. The sky belonged to Zeus. The sea belonged to Poseidon. The realm of the dead belonged to Hades. The other gods had their own powers and responsibilities. And below them, on the surface of the earth, another kind of life was beginning to change. Humanity. The mortal world was still young. Humans had no divine immortality. They had no great wings. They could not command storms. They could not summon lightning. They could not live forever. They were vulnerable to almost everything around them. The cold could kill them. Wild animals could kill them. Hunger could kill them. Disease could kill them. Even the darkness of night could become dangerous. And yet, among all the creatures of the earth, humans possessed something unusual. They could learn. They could remember. They could cooperate. They could create. And one immortal being believed that these fragile creatures deserved a chance. His name was Prometheus. Prometheus belonged to the ancient race of Titans. He was not one of the gods who had been defeated and imprisoned after the Great War. Instead, Prometheus had recognized that the old order was changing. He had sided with Zeus. But Prometheus was different from many of the other divine beings. He was associated with intelligence, foresight, and cleverness. Even his name was connected with the idea of thinking ahead. He could see possibilities that others did not notice. And when he looked at humanity, he did not see weakness. He saw potential. The humans were small. They were mortal. They were frightened by the forces of nature. But Prometheus believed that they could become something more. He wanted to give them knowledge. He wanted to give them tools. He wanted to help them survive. And above all, he wanted to give them fire. Fire was one of the greatest powers in the ancient world. Today, fire is familiar. We can create it with a switch. We can produce heat with machines. We can cook food without thinking about the process. But to ancient people, fire was almost miraculous. A small flame could transform an entire night. It could turn darkness into light. It could protect a family from cold. It could cook food. It could harden materials. It could melt metal. It could help people build. It could allow human beings to work long after the sun disappeared. Fire was not simply warmth. It was technology. It was survival. It was civilization. And according to the myth, fire belonged to the gods. Prometheus believed that humans needed it. Zeus disagreed. The king of the gods did not want humanity to possess too much power. There was a reason for his concern. Humans were mortal. But if mortals gained divine knowledge, what would happen? Would they become arrogant? Would they challenge the gods? Would they stop respecting the boundary between human beings and immortals? Zeus wanted the distance between gods and mortals to remain. Prometheus did not. He believed that humanity deserved the opportunity to develop. And eventually, he decided to act. He stole fire from the gods. The ancient stories describe different details. Some say he concealed the flame inside a hollow fennel stalk. He carried it away from the divine realm, and then he brought it down to humanity. For the first time, humans possessed fire. The darkness changed. Small flames appeared. People gathered around them. They discovered warmth. They discovered light. They learned to cook. They learned to work materials. They began to understand the possibilities of the world around them. Prometheus had given humanity a gift. But Zeus saw the act differently. To Zeus, Prometheus had disobeyed the king of the gods. This was not simply a small act of kindness. It was rebellion. The king had established a boundary. Prometheus had crossed it. And Zeus would not allow the challenge to go unanswered. The punishment would be severe. Prometheus was seized. He was taken to a remote place, a barren landscape where no human civilization could reach him. There, Zeus ordered him chained to a mountain. The chains were strong. Prometheus could not break them. He could not escape. And his punishment was designed to continue day after day. Each morning, an eagle would come. It would feed upon his liver. Because Prometheus was immortal, the wound would heal. And the next day, the eagle would return. Again, and again, and again. The punishment had no natural end. The pain would repeat endlessly. The Greeks imagined this as one of the great examples of divine punishment. Prometheus had helped humanity, but he had challenged Zeus. And Zeus wanted the world to understand the price of defying the king. Yet Prometheus did not surrender. He remained chained. He endured. He knew that he had broken the law. But he also believed that what he had done was right. He had given humanity a chance. The fire remained. Humans continued using it. Civilization developed. The gift could not simply be taken back. And this created a deeper problem for Zeus. He could punish Prometheus, but he could not easily undo what had already been given to humanity. So Zeus decided that humanity itself would receive another kind of gift. A gift that would appear beautiful. A gift that would carry a hidden danger. This was the beginning of Pandora. The gods gathered. They created a woman unlike anything humanity had seen before. Each god contributed something: beauty, grace, skill, charm, intelligence, and other qualities. She was given a name, Pandora. The name is often interpreted as connected with the idea of receiving gifts from all the gods. She was not created simply as a human woman. She was created as part of Zeus's response to Prometheus. She would be sent into the human world. And with her would come a mysterious container. Later generations would call it Pandora's box. But the earliest Greek tradition described it more accurately as a jar. Inside were forces that humanity had not yet experienced. Suffering, disease, pain, hardship, the many difficulties that would eventually become part of mortal life. Pandora was given the container. She was warned. She was not supposed to open it. The instruction was simple: do not open it. But the mystery itself became powerful. Imagine possessing a sealed container and being told that something important was hidden inside. The more you are told not to look, the more you want to know. Pandora eventually opened it. The moment the container was opened, the contents escaped. The troubles of the world spread outward. Pain entered human life. Disease, suffering, labor, old age, misfortune. The perfect world that humans had imagined was gone. The lid was closed again. But it was too late. The forces had escaped. Only one thing remained inside: hope. Hope stayed behind. And that detail became one of the most enduring mysteries of the story. Why was hope left inside? Was it because hope was the one thing humanity would always need? Was it because hope itself was another kind of gift? Or was the story suggesting something darker? The ancient Greeks did not always give a single answer. Mythology often leaves room for interpretation, but the image is powerful. Human beings were given suffering. They were given mortality. They were given uncertainty. And yet, hope remained. Even in the darkest moments, people could still imagine something better. They could still wait for morning. They could still rebuild after destruction. They could still love. They could still dream. And perhaps that was why hope was so important. because the gods possessed immortality. Humans did not. Every human life had an ending. Every generation would disappear. Every family would experience loss. But hope allowed mortals to continue. The story of Prometheus and Pandora therefore became more than a simple punishment. It became a story about the complicated relationship between gods and humans. Prometheus represented knowledge, fire, progress, defiance. Pandora represented the consequences that followed. And Zeus stood above both. He was the king, the ruler who believed that order required boundaries. But Zeus's relationship with humanity would never remain simple. He would punish humans. He would protect them. He would help some. He would destroy others. He would reward heroes. He would punish kings. He would fall in love with mortals. And he would father children who would become some of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology. This was the beginning of that complicated relationship. The world of humans continued to grow. Villages became settlements. Settlements became cities. People learned agriculture. They learned crafts. They learned navigation. They began building temples. They created stories. They looked at the sky, and they wondered about the gods. High above them, Zeus watched. The king of Olympus had established his throne. But Zeus was not a distant ruler who never interacted with the mortal world. He was constantly involved. He could send rain. He could send storms. He could protect travelers. He could punish those who broke sacred oaths. He could bless kings. He could destroy armies. The ancient Greeks saw his influence everywhere. When thunder rolled across the sky, Zeus was nearby. When lightning appeared in the darkness, it was his weapon. When storms gathered over the mountains, people imagined the presence of the king of the gods. His authority was enormous. But with authority came responsibility. Zeus was now expected to maintain order among gods and humans. And maintaining that order would become increasingly difficult, because the gods themselves were not always obedient. Hera, his wife and sister, possessed immense power of her own. Poseidon was proud and independent. Hades ruled an entire kingdom beneath the earth. Athena would eventually become one of Zeus's most trusted allies. Apollo and Artemis would develop their own influence. Ares would embody the violence of war. Aphrodite would command desire. Hermes would move between worlds. Every god had a role. Every god had power. And Zeus had to keep them from destroying one another. The king's authority would often be tested, sometimes openly, sometimes through jealousy, sometimes through prophecy, and sometimes through love, because Zeus had one weakness that would become one of the defining characteristics of his mythology. He was fascinated by mortals. He noticed their beauty, their intelligence, their courage, their ambition, their ability to create meaning despite knowing that their lives were temporary. Zeus could live forever. Humans could not. Perhaps that difference made mortals interesting to him. A human life was short. A human decision mattered because there was not unlimited time. A mortal could become a hero in a single generation. A king could build a city and know that one day his descendants would walk through it. A warrior could fight knowing that death was possible. A poet could create a song hoping that someone would remember it. The gods had eternity. Humans had memory, and Zeus became deeply involved in both worlds. But before his stories of heroes and lovers could unfold, another question remained. Who would stand beside him? Who would become Queen of Olympus? The answer was Hera. But their marriage would not be simple. Hera was not merely Zeus's wife. She was a powerful goddess in her own right. She represented marriage, women, family, royal authority, and the sacred bond between husband and wife. Yet Zeus was not known for remaining faithful. His many relationships would become some of the most famous and complicated stories in Greek mythology. Hera's response to these relationships would often be anger, and that anger would sometimes fall not upon Zeus, but upon the women and children connected to him. This would create stories of jealousy, punishment, and revenge. But Hera was not simply a jealous wife. She was also one of the most powerful figures on Olympus. She could challenge Zeus. She could influence the other gods. She could participate in divine decisions. Their relationship was therefore a struggle between two powerful rulers within the same household. Zeus sat at the center of Olympus. Hera stood beside him, and together they represented the complicated structure of divine kingship. But Zeus's family would continue to expand. His children would include gods, heroes, kings, warriors, and figures whose stories would become central to Greek mythology. Among the most famous would be Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, Dionysus. Persephone was connected to another branch of the divine family, and among Zeus's mortal children would be some of the greatest heroes of Greek legend: Perseus, Heracles, and others. Each would carry some connection to the king of the gods. Each would inherit something from him: strength, intelligence, authority, or simply the attention of the divine world. The stories would become increasingly complicated, because every time Zeus entered the mortal world, consequences followed. A child might be born. A kingdom might change. A family might be cursed. A hero might rise. A monster might be defeated. A war might begin. The king of the gods was becoming the center of an enormous network of myths, and the ancient Greeks used these stories to explore the world around them. Why do people suffer? Why does injustice exist? Why do families fight? Why do rulers become arrogant? Why do humans fear death? Why do people hope? Why do storms come? Why does fortune suddenly change? The myths did not always provide simple answers. Instead, they gave these questions faces. Zeus represented the sky. Prometheus represented intelligence and rebellion. Pandora represented the uncertain gift of life. The Titans represented an older world. The Olympians represented a new order, and humanity stood between them. Mortal, fragile, but capable of extraordinary things. The age of Zeus was now firmly established. The old gods had fallen. The new gods ruled. The humans possessed fire. Hope remained, and the world continued. But Zeus had not yet reached the height of his influence. His greatest stories were still ahead. He would become involved in the lives of heroes. He would intervene in wars. He would judge kings. He would face challenges from within Olympus. He would make alliances. He would create enemies. And he would encounter prophecies that reminded him of the same fear that once destroyed his father: the fear of being overthrown. Cronus had tried to prevent prophecy. Zeus would try to understand it. And one day, a prophecy would appear concerning a child who could become more powerful than Zeus himself. The king of the gods would have to decide whether to repeat Cronus's mistake or find another way. For now, however, Olympus was peaceful. The fires burned in the divine halls. The mountains stood beneath the stars. The sea moved far below. The mortal world continued its slow development. And high above it all, Zeus sat upon his golden throne. The thunderbolt rested beside him. The clouds moved across the moon. The distant mountains disappeared into mist. The king of the gods had won his war. He had survived his father's fear. He had defeated the Titans. He had defeated the giants. He had defeated Typhon. He had established Olympus, but ruling the universe was not the end of his story. It was the beginning, because now Zeus would have to deal with the gods who lived beside him, the mortals who worshipped him, and the heroes who would carry his blood into the world. Among those heroes would be a man whose strength would become legendary, a man who would perform 12 impossible labors, a man who would become one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology. His name would be Heracles, and his story would begin with Zeus. The king of the gods was about to enter the world of heroes, and the next chapter of his reign would show just how complicated divine power could become. The world had changed. The Titans were gone. The ancient monsters had been defeated. Olympus stood above the mortal world, and Zeus had become the undisputed king of the gods. But the story of Zeus was no longer only a story about wars between divine beings. The age of heroes was beginning, and many of those heroes would be connected to Zeus himself. Some would be born from gods and goddesses. Others would be born from the union between gods and mortals. These children would occupy a strange position in the ancient world. They would not be completely divine. They would not be completely ordinary. They would be mortal beings carrying something of the gods within them. The Greeks called such figures heroes, and among the greatest of them would be Perseus and Heracles. Their stories would become inseparable from the mythology of Zeus. But before the heroes came into the world, Zeus had already become deeply involved in the affairs of mortals. He watched kings. He watched cities. He watched families. He watched people struggle with the shortness of their lives. And sometimes he intervened. One of the most famous stories began in the city of Argos. There lived a king named Acrisius. Acrisius had a daughter named Danae. She was his only child. And like many kings in Greek mythology, Acrisius wanted to know what the future held. So he consulted an oracle. The message he received terrified him. He was told that Danae would have a son, and that son would one day cause his grandfather's death. Acrisius was horrified. He had spent his life building his kingdom. He had fought for his position. He had imagined growing old as king. And now a prophecy told him that his own grandson would one day bring about his death. The prophecy gave him no peace. He could not simply kill his daughter. She was his child, but he believed he could prevent her from ever having a child. So he imprisoned Danae. He placed her inside an underground chamber. Some versions of the story describe a bronze chamber, a place sealed away from the outside world. Acrisius believed that if Danae could never meet a man, she could never give birth to the child described by the prophecy. He thought he had defeated fate, but the gods had other plans. Zeus had seen Danae, and he became interested in her. According to the ancient myth, Zeus approached the chamber in a miraculous form. He appeared as a shower of golden light. The light passed through the sealed space, and Danae became pregnant. The child was Perseus, a hero whose name would eventually become famous throughout Greece. When Acrisius discovered that Danae had given birth, his fear returned. The prophecy had not been stopped. It had happened. A child now existed, and the child might someday kill him. Acrisius could not bring himself to kill his own daughter and grandson directly. Instead, he placed them inside a wooden chest. He sealed it and pushed it into the sea. The sea carried the chest away. Danae held her child. She did not know where the waves would take them. The world seemed enormous. The sea had no mercy, but the chest survived. Eventually, it reached the island of Seriphos. There, a fisherman named Dictys found it. He opened the chest and discovered Danae and the infant Perseus alive. He rescued them, He brought them to safety. Years passed. Perseus grew. He became strong. He became brave. And eventually, he was given a task that seemed impossible. He would have to face Medusa. Medusa was one of the Gorgons. She had snakes instead of hair. Her face was terrifying, and anyone who looked directly into her eyes would be turned to stone. Perseus could not defeat such a creature by ordinary means. If he looked directly at Medusa, he would die. So the gods helped him. Athena gave him guidance. Hermes provided assistance. Perseus received special equipment, and he developed a plan. He would not look directly at Medusa. Instead, he would use the reflection of her face on a polished shield. He approached her while she slept. The snakes around her head moved slowly. Her breathing was heavy. Perseus looked only at the reflection. He raised his sword and struck. Medusa was defeated. Perseus escaped with her head. Even after death, Medusa's head retained its power. Perseus could use it as a weapon. The hero eventually returned, and his story became one of the great examples of the connection between gods and heroes. Perseus was mortal, but divine intervention had helped him accomplish what an ordinary human could never have done. His story also demonstrated something important about Zeus. The king of the gods was not simply sitting on Olympus watching the world. His influence moved through generations. His decisions created heroes. Those heroes changed kingdoms. They defeated monsters. They founded dynasties. And their descendants would shape Greek mythology for centuries. But Perseus was only one of Zeus's famous children. Another would become even more famous. His name was Heracles. The Romans would later call him Hercules, but the Greeks knew him as Heracles. And his story would begin with another mortal woman, Alcmene. Alcmene was a noble woman. She was married to Amphitryon. Her husband was away when Zeus became interested in her. But Zeus did not approach her openly. Instead, he took the appearance of her husband. He returned to her in the form of Amphitryon. Alcmene believed that her husband had returned. She welcomed him, and from that encounter, a child was conceived, Heracles. But Zeus was not the only father involved in Heracles' birth. Alcmene later conceived another child with her actual husband. That child was Iphicles. The two boys would grow up together. One was the son of Zeus. The other was the son of a mortal man. The difference between them would become important, because Heracles possessed extraordinary strength. Even as a young child, his power was unusual. But Heracles' life would not be easy. Hera hated him. Heracles was a constant reminder of Zeus's unfaithfulness. To Hera, the child was not simply an innocent hero. He was evidence of Zeus's betrayal. So Hera decided to make Heracles suffer. The goddess sent madness upon him. In his madness, Heracles committed a terrible act. When the madness passed, he was horrified by what he had done. He was filled with guilt. He wanted to know how he could atone. He sought guidance, and eventually he was told that he would have to serve King Eurystheus. This service would lead to the famous labors of Heracles, 12 tasks, 12 impossible challenges. The first was the Nemean lion. The lion was not an ordinary animal. Its hide could not be pierced by normal weapons. Heracles tried to use his sword. It failed. He tried other weapons. They failed. Eventually, he realized that strength and strategy had to work together. He trapped the lion. He fought it directly. And finally, he defeated it. He wore the lion's hide afterward. It became one of his defining symbols. But the labors continued. The Hydra, a monstrous serpent with multiple heads. Whenever one head was cut off, more could appear. Heracles needed help from his nephew Iolaus. Together, they developed a strategy. When Heracles struck one head, Iolaus burned the wound so that another could not grow. Eventually, the Hydra was defeated. The labors continued. The Ceryneian hind, the Erymanthian boar, the Augean stables, the Stymphalian birds, the Cretan bull, the mares of Diomedes, the belt of Hippolyta, the cattle of Geryon, the apples of the Hesperides, and finally, Cerberus, the three-headed guardian of the underworld. Each labor tested something different: strength, patience, intelligence, endurance, courage. Heracles was not simply the strongest man alive. He was a hero who repeatedly faced impossible situations. And behind his story was Zeus, his divine father. But Zeus did not simply hand Heracles victory. The hero had to suffer. He had to work. He had to endure humiliation. He had to face monsters. He had to confront his own mistakes. The gods could open doors, but the hero still had to walk through them. This became one of the central ideas of Greek hero mythology. Being connected to a god did not make a mortal invincible. A hero could still suffer. A hero could still die. A hero could still make terrible mistakes. What made a hero different was what he did afterward. Heracles continued. Even when his life became unbearable, he continued. His strength became legendary. But his story also showed the complicated nature of Zeus's relationship with his children. Zeus could create heroes, but he could not always protect them from suffering. Sometimes his own actions caused their troubles. Sometimes Hera attacked them. Sometimes the gods themselves became obstacles. The world of Greek mythology was not a world where divine parentage guaranteed happiness. It was often the opposite. The children of gods carried enormous expectations. They became targets of divine jealousy. They were expected to achieve extraordinary things, and they lived under the shadow of their divine ancestry. Perseus carried the blood of Zeus. Heracles carried it too. But their stories were very different. Perseus was associated with Medusa and the rescue of Andromeda. Heracles became the greatest symbol of physical strength and endurance. Both became heroes because they lived extraordinary lives. And both eventually became part of the greater mythological world created by Zeus. But Zeus' children were not limited to heroes. He also fathered gods, and one of the most important was Athena. Athena's birth was unlike any ordinary birth. She did not have a normal childhood. She emerged from Zeus himself. The story began with another prophecy. Zeus had learned from the fate of Cronus. He knew the danger of prophecy, and one prophecy warned him about a child born from Metis. Metis was associated with wisdom and cunning intelligence. Zeus feared that a child born from her might eventually become more powerful than him. The memory of Cronus was still alive. Zeus did not want to repeat his father's mistake, so he swallowed Metis. But the child had already been conceived, and something strange happened. Zeus developed a terrible headache. The pain became unbearable. He needed help. Hephaestus, the divine craftsman, was called, and according to the myth, Hephaestus struck Zeus's head with an axe. The wound opened, and from the head of Zeus emerged Athena, fully armed, fully grown, ready for battle. She was not an ordinary goddess. Athena represented wisdom, strategy, craftsmanship, and disciplined warfare. She would become one of Zeus's most important allies. Unlike Ares, who represented the violent and chaotic side of war, Athena represented strategy, planning, intelligence, control. She was a warrior who understood that the strongest battle was sometimes won before the first weapon was raised. Zeus recognized her importance. Athena became one of his closest divine companions. And the birth of Athena revealed another side of Zeus. He did not simply produce children, he incorporated their qualities into the divine order. His children became extensions of the powers that shaped the world. Athena represented wisdom. Apollo would represent light, prophecy, music, and healing. Artemis would become associated with the wilderness and the hunt. Hermes would become messenger of the gods. Dionysus would bring transformation, wine, and ecstatic celebration. The Olympian family was expanding, and Zeus stood at its center. But as his family expanded, so did the number of conflicts. Every new god brought new relationships. Every relationship brought new alliances. And every alliance could create new enemies. Zeus's palace became the center of an enormous divine network. The king of the gods had gone from hidden child to warrior, to ruler, to father. His influence now reached almost every part of Greek mythology. But there was still a problem. Zeus had learned from Cronus. He feared prophecy, and eventually another prophecy would emerge. A prophecy involving a goddess named Thetis. Thetis was one of the Nereids. She was beautiful, powerful, and the gods themselves were interested in her. But a prophecy warned that Thetis's son would become greater than his father. This was dangerous. If Zeus fathered such a child, the pattern of Cronus could repeat. The son might one day overthrow him. So Zeus made a decision. Thetis would not marry Zeus. She would marry a mortal. The mortal was Peleus, and from their union came Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, the man whose name would become almost synonymous with heroic strength and tragic destiny. Once again, Zeus had shaped the future. By refusing to father a child with Thetis, he had prevented another possible challenge to his throne. But he had also created one of the greatest heroes in Greek mythology. Achilles would eventually fight at Troy. He would become famous. He would die young, and his story would become immortal. This was the strange nature of Zeus's reign. His decisions could reach far beyond his own lifetime. A choice made on Olympus could lead to a war generations later. A divine relationship could produce a hero. A prophecy could determine a marriage. A moment of jealousy could destroy a family. The gods were immortal, but their actions created consequences that moved through mortal history. Zeus was beginning to understand this. The king of the gods had enormous power, but power always created responsibility, and sometimes power created fear. Zeus had spent his childhood hiding from Cronus. He had watched his father try to defeat prophecy. He had overthrown him. Now Zeus himself had become the ruler who feared the future. He did not want another child to replace him. He did not want another generation to rise against Olympus. So he watched the prophecies. He watched the gods. He watched mortals. And he watched his own family. The age of heroes was beginning. Across the mortal world, cities were growing. Kings were establishing dynasties. Heroes were being born. Monsters were appearing. And stories were spreading from one generation to another. Perseus had defeated Medusa. Heracles had completed his labors. Athena had emerged from the head of Zeus. Achilles would soon become the greatest warrior of Troy. And behind these stories stood the king of Olympus, Zeus, the god of thunder, the ruler of the sky, the protector of oaths, the father of gods and heroes. But Zeus was not yet finished shaping the mortal world. One of the most famous events in Greek mythology was approaching: the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. Almost every great god would be present, and almost every important divine figure would be involved. But one goddess would be left out. Her name was Eris, the goddess of discord. And her exclusion would lead to an object that would eventually help start one of the greatest wars in Greek mythology, the Trojan War, the war that would eventually produce Achilles, the war that would eventually produce the journey of Odysseus, the war that would connect the mythology of Zeus to the stories we have already explored. Everything was beginning to connect: the gods, the heroes, the prophecies, the kingdoms, the wars, and the stories of mortals. The age of Zeus had created a world where divine decisions and human lives were deeply connected. And soon, one golden object would be thrown into a gathering of the gods. A simple object, a golden apple. It would carry a message for the fairest. 3 goddesses would claim it: Hera, Athena, Aphrodite. And Zeus would refuse to choose between them. Instead, he would place the decision in the hands of a mortal prince. His name was Paris, and his decision would change the ancient world forever. The world of the gods had become stable. Zeus ruled from Olympus. The ancient Titans had been defeated. The giants had fallen. Typhon had been buried beneath the earth. The gods had their kingdoms. The mortals had their cities. And the age of heroes was beginning. But even in a world ruled by powerful gods, peace was never guaranteed. A single decision could change the future. A single insult could create hatred. A single promise could lead armies toward war. And sometimes, the greatest disasters began with something that seemed almost insignificant: a golden apple. The story began with a wedding. Peleus, a mortal king, was going to marry Thetis. Thetis was not an ordinary woman. She was one of the Nereids, divine sea beings associated with the ancient waters. She was beautiful and powerful, and once, even Zeus had been interested in her. But the prophecy surrounding Thetis had changed everything. Her son would become greater than his father. Zeus did not want to create another potential rival. So Thetis was married to Peleus. Their wedding was attended by gods and divine beings. It should have been a celebration, a moment when the mortal and divine worlds came together. The gods gathered. They brought gifts. They celebrated. Music filled the halls. The wedding appeared peaceful. But one goddess had not been invited: Eris, the goddess of discord. Eris represented conflict, arguments, rivalry, the small disagreements that could become enormous disasters. Her exclusion from the wedding offended her, and instead of simply leaving, she decided to create trouble. Eris took a golden apple. It was beautiful. Its surface shone like sunlight. And upon it was written a simple message: for the fairest. The apple was thrown among the assembled goddesses. At first, it seemed like a harmless object, but 3 goddesses immediately wanted it: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each believed that she was the fairest. Each believed that the apple belonged to her. And suddenly, the wedding celebration became a competition. The 3 goddesses went to Zeus. They asked him to decide who was the fairest, who deserved the golden apple. Zeus faced a problem. Hera was his wife. Athena was his daughter. Aphrodite was one of the most powerful goddesses of love and beauty. If Zeus chose one, the other 2 would be offended. The king of the gods knew that there was no safe answer, so he refused to judge them himself. Instead, he selected a mortal, a young prince from Troy. His name was Paris. Paris was the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. He lived in the great city of Troy. But Paris's life had already been touched by prophecy. Before his birth, his mother had dreamed that she was carrying a burning object. The dream was interpreted as a warning. The child would one day bring destruction to Troy. Because of this prophecy, Paris had been abandoned as an infant. But he survived. He grew up away from the palace. He became a shepherd. He lived a simple life. He did not know that he was a prince. He did not know that his family still ruled Troy. And he certainly did not know that the gods would one day place the fate of their world in his hands. Then the goddesses found him. Zeus had chosen Paris to judge them. Hera appeared before him. She offered him power. If Paris chose Hera, she promised that he could become one of the greatest rulers in the world. He could possess wealth, kingdoms, political authority, everything a mortal king could desire. Athena made a different offer. She promised wisdom, military success, victory in war. If Paris chose her, he could become the greatest warrior among mortals. His name could become legendary. Then Aphrodite approached. She offered something different. She promised him the most beautiful woman in the world. Her name was Helen. Paris made his decision. He gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. The goddess of beauty had won, but the decision had consequences. Helen was already married. She was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta, and according to the myth, Paris traveled to Sparta. There, he met Helen. The goddess Aphrodite had promised that she would belong to him. Whereas, took Helen away to Troy. Whether Helen went willingly or was taken against her will varies among different ancient traditions. But one thing remained constant. Helen was now in Troy, and Menelaus wanted her back. The Greek kings gathered. They had sworn an oath long before, an oath connected to Helen's marriage. They had agreed that if anyone tried to take Helen away, they would defend her marriage. Now the oath was activated. Kings from across Greece prepared their ships. Warriors gathered. Weapons were forged. Armies assembled. And among those warriors was Achilles, the son of Peleus and Thetis, the hero whose birth had been connected to the very wedding where the golden apple had appeared. Everything was connected. The gods, the heroes, the prophecies, the wedding, the apple, the judgment, and now, war. The Greeks sailed toward Troy. The city stood behind enormous walls. It was wealthy, powerful, beautiful, and difficult to conquer. King Priam ruled there. His sons included Hector and Paris. Hector was a warrior, a prince, a defender of his city. Paris was more associated with beauty and desire than warfare. The two brothers were very different. Hector understood what the arrival of the Greek army meant. Troy was in danger. Thousands of warriors had crossed the sea. They wanted Helen, they wanted revenge, and they wanted Paris to pay for his decision. But the gods were divided. Some supported the Greeks. Others supported Troy. Hera hated Paris because he had rejected her. Athena also hated him because he had chosen Aphrodite. Aphrodite, however, protected Paris. The gods had become involved in the war, and Zeus had to maintain a difficult position. He was the king of the gods. He could not simply behave like a warrior supporting one side. He had to consider the larger order. Yet Zeus also had his own preferences. He had relationships with both sides. The Trojan royal family had divine connections. The Greeks had heroes who were connected to the gods. And Zeus knew that whatever happened at Troy would have consequences far beyond the battlefield. The war began. For years, the Greeks attacked. For years, the Trojans defended their city. The conflict became one of the greatest wars remembered in ancient mythology. But the story was not simply about Helen. It was about honor, pride, promises, revenge, fame, and the fragile relationship between gods and mortals. The Greeks wanted victory. The Trojans wanted survival. The gods wanted their own interests, and Zeus watched from above. One of the most important warriors on the Greek side was Achilles. Achilles was almost impossible to defeat. He was fast, powerful, fearless. He became the greatest warrior among the Greeks. But Achilles had one weakness: his pride. And eventually, his pride would bring him into conflict with the Greek commander, Agamemnon. The disagreement became so serious that Achilles withdrew from the fighting. Without Achilles, the Greeks suffered. The Trojans pushed them back. Hector became the great defender of Troy. He fought not only for glory. He fought for his family, for his wife Andromache, for his child, for his city. Hector represented a different kind of heroism. Achilles fought for honor and immortal fame. Hector fought because people depended on him. The two heroes would eventually meet, but before that happened, the gods continued interfering. Apollo supported Troy. Athena supported the Greeks. Hera opposed Troy. Aphrodite protected Paris. Poseidon sometimes helped the Greeks. The battlefield became a place where divine conflicts were reflected through human warriors. Zeus attempted to maintain control, but even he could not completely prevent the other gods from becoming involved. The war continued. Eventually, Achilles returned to battle, but he returned for a deeply personal reason. His closest companion, Patroclus, had been killed by Hector. Achilles was devastated. His anger became overwhelming. He returned to the battlefield, and there he confronted Hector. The two greatest warriors of the war finally stood against one another. Hector knew what he was facing, but he did not run. He fought. The battle was fierce. Eventually, Achilles defeated Hector. Troy's greatest defender was dead. The city mourned. King Priam mourned. Andromache mourned. The Trojans mourned. Even the gods recognized the significance of Hector's death. Achilles had won, but victory did not bring peace. The war continued. Achilles himself would soon die. His death was connected to Paris. The prince who had caused the conflict would eventually fire the arrow that killed the greatest Greek warrior. Again, the gods became involved. The hero who seemed almost unstoppable was finally brought down. The Greeks had lost one of their greatest warriors, but Troy was still standing. The city walls remained. The war seemed endless. Then Odysseus proposed a different strategy. The Greeks could not defeat Troy by attacking the walls directly, so they would use deception. They built a giant wooden horse. Inside it, Greek soldiers hid. The rest of the army pretended to sail away. The Trojans saw the abandoned horse. They wondered what it meant. Some warned them not to bring it inside, but others believed it was a gift. Eventually, the horse was brought into Troy. The city celebrated. The war appeared to be over. That night, when the Trojans slept, the Greek soldiers emerged. They opened the gates. The Greek army returned. Troy was attacked from within. The city fell. The great walls were breached. The kingdom was destroyed. The war that had begun with a golden apple had ended in fire, and Zeus had watched the entire chain of events unfold. One small object, one competition, one decision by Paris, one promise, one act of love, one act of revenge, and eventually, a decade of war. This was one of the most important lessons contained within Greek mythology. The gods were powerful, but even they could not always control the consequences of their actions. Eris wanted revenge. The goddesses wanted recognition. Paris wanted beauty. Menelaus wanted his wife. The Greeks wanted honor. The Trojans wanted survival. And every decision pushed the world closer toward destruction. Zeus had become king because he understood power. But the Trojan War showed that power alone could not control destiny. The gods could influence events. They could help warriors. They could send storms. They could protect cities. But prophecy remained. Fate remained. And the consequences of choices remained. The fall of Troy changed the world of Greek mythology. The heroes who survived would begin their journeys home. Some would return quickly. Others would wander for years. Agamemnon would return to a terrible fate. Menelaus would eventually recover Helen, and Odysseus would begin the long journey that would become the Odyssey. The story of Zeus was now connected directly to the story of the wandering king of Ithaca. The same gods who had shaped the Trojan War would follow the survivors home. Athena would protect Odysseus. Poseidon would oppose him. Circe would delay him. The sea would test him. And eventually, after years of wandering, Odysseus would return to Ithaca. The Trojan War therefore became the bridge between many of the greatest Greek myths. It connected Zeus and Olympus to Achilles. It connected Achilles to Troy, Troy to Odysseus, Odysseus to the gods, and the gods back to Zeus. The king of Olympus remained at the center. But the world below him was changing. The age of the great heroes had reached its height, and soon it would begin to fade. Zeus had ruled through the rise of heroes. He had watched cities grow. He had watched wars begin. He had watched mortals become legends. But even the greatest heroes eventually died. The gods remained, immortal, unchanging, watching generation after generation rise and disappear. And perhaps this was one of the greatest differences between Zeus and humanity. Zeus could watch centuries pass. Humans could not. For a mortal, a lifetime was everything. For Zeus, a lifetime was only a moment. And yet, the stories of mortals continued to matter to him. Their struggles, their victories, their failures, their love, their sacrifices, their hopes. The gods lived forever. But humans created meaning within the short time they were given. And Zeus, more than almost any other Greek god, remained deeply connected to that mortal world. His children walked among humans. His decisions shaped kingdoms. His relationships created heroes. His anger destroyed cities. His protection saved lives. His thunder ruled the heavens. But his greatest challenge was still waiting, because Zeus had learned from Cronus. He knew that every ruler eventually faced the question of succession. Who would come after him? Would his children remain loyal? Would another god challenge him? Would another prophecy emerge? And could Zeus avoid the fate that had destroyed his own father? The king of Olympus had survived everything the ancient world had thrown against him. But now the myths would turn toward his own household, toward Hera, toward the other Olympians, toward the gods who sometimes questioned his authority, and toward the stories that would reveal Zeus not simply as a thunder god, but as a complicated ruler, a father, a husband, a brother, a lover, a judge, a protector, and sometimes a source of chaos himself. The age of heroes had begun to fade. The great war at Troy had ended. The ships were leaving the ruined city. The survivors were returning home. And above the mortal world, Zeus remained upon his throne. The thunder clouds gathered around Olympus. Lightning flashed far across the sky. The king of the gods watched the world below. His reign had survived, but the stories of Zeus were far from finished. The greatest challenge to his authority would not come from the Titans. It would not come from the giants. It would not come from Typhon. It would come from within Olympus itself. And when the gods themselves began to question their king, Zeus would have to prove that winning the throne was only the beginning of becoming its rightful ruler. The war at Troy had ended. The great city had fallen. The heroes had begun their journeys home. And from the heights of Olympus, Zeus watched the mortal world return to silence. The armies were gone. The ships were disappearing over the horizon. The smoke rising from Troy slowly faded. But for Zeus, the end of the Trojan War did not mean the end of his responsibilities. He was still king, and ruling the gods was not always peaceful. The stories of Zeus are often remembered for thunder, for lightning, for storms, for enormous battles. But the longer Zeus ruled, the more complicated his kingdom became. His greatest challenges were no longer simply monsters. They were relationships. His brothers, his sisters, his wife, his children, and sometimes the other gods themselves. The throne of Olympus was powerful, but it was not always comfortable. Zeus had inherited the universe after defeating Cronus. Yet he understood something that his father had failed to understand. Power could not be maintained through fear alone. Cronus had tried to destroy every possible threat. He had swallowed his children. He had attempted to prevent the future, but his fear had created rebellion. Zeus wanted something different. He wanted the gods to recognize his authority. He wanted the universe to remain organized. He wanted the Olympians to accept his decisions. But that did not mean they always agreed with him. The gods had their own personalities, their own powers, their own loyalties. And one goddess stood especially close to Zeus, Hera. She was his wife, his sister, and one of the most powerful gods on Olympus. Hera was associated with marriage, family, queenship, and the protection of women. She was not merely the wife of Zeus. She was the queen of the gods, and her position gave her tremendous influence. But her marriage to Zeus was complicated. The ancient myths tell many stories of Zeus's relationships with other women. Some were goddesses, some were nymphs, some were mortal women, and from these relationships came many of Zeus's children. Hera knew, and she was often furious, but her anger was not always directed toward Zeus. In many myths, the people who suffered most were the women and children connected to him. This created a strange contradiction. Zeus represented marriage and sacred oaths, yet he repeatedly violated the expectations associated with marriage. The myths did not hide this contradiction. Instead, they made it part of his character. Zeus was powerful, but he was not perfect. He could be wise, he could be generous, he could protect the innocent, and he could also act selfishly. The Greeks did not imagine their gods as flawless beings. They gave them human emotions on an enormous scale. Love became divine. Jealousy became divine. Anger became divine. Pride became divine. And because the gods were immortal, their conflicts could last for generations. Hera's anger toward Zeus, therefore, became a recurring force in mythology. Sometimes she confronted him directly. Sometimes she plotted against his decisions. Sometimes she punished those connected to his affairs. But Zeus could not simply remove Hera. She was too powerful. She was his queen. She was one of the original Olympians, and she had her own divine authority. Their relationship was therefore not simply a marriage. It was also a political partnership. Two powerful rulers sharing the same divine household. Sometimes they agreed. Sometimes they fought. And sometimes their disagreements affected the mortal world. One famous example involved Heracles. Hera's hatred of Heracles began because he was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman. She saw him as a living reminder of Zeus's betrayal. Heracles suffered because of that hatred. The labors that made him famous were partly connected to the consequences of Hera's actions and the madness she had caused. And yet, despite everything, Heracles eventually became more than simply a victim. He became a legendary hero. His strength became famous. His labors became stories told across Greece. And after his death, he was eventually accepted among the gods. In this way, even Hera's anger could not prevent the destiny of Zeus's son. The story demonstrated something important. The gods could influence fate, but they did not always control everything. There were limits. Prophecy existed. Fate existed. And even Zeus sometimes had to respect forces greater than his personal wishes. This was one reason Zeus feared prophecy. He had watched his father lose everything because of it. He had inherited the throne through a prophecy. And he knew that the future could never be completely controlled. One of the most famous challenges to Zeus's authority came from within Olympus itself. The other gods sometimes became tired of his decisions. They believed he could be too harsh, too controlling, too willing to impose his will. And according to one ancient story, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, and other gods once conspired against him. They wanted to restrain Zeus. The details differ among ancient traditions. But the central idea is powerful. Even the king of the gods could be challenged. The gods captured Zeus and bound him. For a moment, the ruler of Olympus was powerless. His own family had turned against him. The thunderbolt could not help him. His authority could not save him. He was physically restrained. The other gods believed that they had finally found a way to limit his power. But Zeus had an ally, the sea goddess Thetis. She called upon Briareus, one of the 100-handed ones. Briareus possessed enormous strength. He had once fought alongside Zeus during the Titanomachy. When he arrived, the other gods became frightened. They released Zeus. The rebellion ended, and Zeus reclaimed his position. The story carried an important message. The king could be challenged, but the king could also be defended. Zeus's reign survived because he had allies, because he had earned loyalty, because the old forces that helped him defeat the Titans still recognized his authority, and because the other gods understood that removing Zeus might create even greater chaos. This was something Cronus had never learned. A ruler could not simply command. A ruler needed relationships. Zeus had become the center of a network of gods who depended upon the stability of Olympus. If Zeus fell, the entire order could collapse. That did not mean the gods always loved him. It meant that they understood the importance of the throne, and Zeus understood it too. He had spent his entire life fighting for it. Now he had to protect it. But Zeus was not simply a ruler who sat upon Olympus. He was also a judge. The ancient Greeks believed that Zeus could observe human behavior. He could see when people broke sacred promises. He could see when guests were mistreated. He could see when rulers abused their power. Hospitality was especially important. A stranger entering a Greek household was supposed to be treated with respect. Food should be offered. Shelter should be provided. The guest should be protected. This principle was connected with Zeus himself. A guest was not simply a stranger. The guest might be under the protection of the gods. To harm someone who had come seeking hospitality could therefore be a serious offense. Zeus was sometimes described as the protector of strangers and guests. This idea helped shape one of the important moral principles of ancient Greek society. Respect those who come to your home. Honor sacred agreements. Do not abuse someone who depends upon your protection. And do not assume that power makes you immune from consequences, because Zeus himself could punish arrogance. The Greeks had a word for destructive pride: hubris. Hubris was more than confidence. It was the belief that one had become so powerful that ordinary limits no longer applied. Kings could suffer from it. Heroes could suffer from it. Even gods could display it. And Zeus often acted as the force that restored balance. When someone became too powerful, Zeus could bring them down. When someone broke an oath, Zeus could punish them. When someone challenged the order of the universe, Zeus could respond. But Zeus was not always consistent. This is another reason Greek mythology remains so fascinating. The stories do not present a simple moral universe where good people are always rewarded and bad people are always punished. The gods themselves could be unpredictable. A person could suffer despite being innocent. A hero could make mistakes and still become legendary. A villain could receive temporary success. A god could behave badly and remain powerful. The myths reflected the uncertainty of human life. The ancient Greeks lived in a world where storms could destroy crops. Ships could disappear. Wars could begin. Children could die. Kings could lose kingdoms. Fortune could change without warning. The gods represented that uncertainty. But Zeus represented something else: order. The belief that despite chaos, there was still a structure to the universe. The sky had a ruler. The gods had a king. The oaths had a guardian. Justice had an authority behind it. And when Zeus sat upon Olympus, the ancient Greeks could imagine that the universe was not completely without order. But Zeus' greatest challenge was still his own family. His children were becoming powerful. Athena had become one of his closest allies. Apollo and Artemis had their own divine authority. Hermes moved between the world of gods and mortals. Ares represented war. Aphrodite represented love and desire. Dionysus represented transformation and celebration. Each new generation made Olympus more complicated, and Zeus had to decide how much freedom to give them. He could not simply repeat Cronus's mistake. He could not swallow his children. He had learned what happened when a father tried to destroy the future. So Zeus allowed his children to grow, but he watched them carefully. Among them, Athena was particularly important. She was not only his daughter, she represented wisdom. She was one of the gods who could challenge him intellectually. In some myths, Zeus valued her judgment. She became a symbol of strategic thought, and she was associated with Athens, one of the greatest cities of ancient Greece. The city believed Athena was its protector. Another god, Poseidon, also wanted influence over the city. The two gods competed. Each wanted to become the city's patron. Poseidon offered the city a gift. He struck the ground with his trident. A spring appeared, but the water was salty. Athena offered an olive tree. The olive tree became one of the most important symbols of Greek civilization. The citizens chose Athena. The city became Athens. The story again showed the competition between the gods. Even the most powerful divine beings wanted recognition, and Zeus stood above them as the ultimate authority. But he did not always interfere. Sometimes the gods were allowed to compete. Sometimes their conflicts were part of the natural order. Zeus intervened when the balance became threatened. This became one of his most important functions. He was not simply a warrior, he was a mediator, a ruler who could settle disputes, a king who could prevent the gods from destroying one another. But keeping peace among immortals was not easy. Their emotions were enormous, their powers were enormous, and their grudges could last forever. The story of Apollo and Hermes illustrates another side of the divine family. Hermes was born with extraordinary intelligence. Even as an infant, he was clever. He stole Apollo's cattle. He tried to hide what he had done. Apollo became angry. The conflict eventually reached Zeus. Zeus listened to both sides. Instead of destroying Hermes, he recognized his cleverness. Hermes became a messenger of the gods. The story demonstrated something important about Zeus as a ruler. He could punish, but he could also recognize talent. He could turn conflict into cooperation. The gods were not always enemies. Sometimes their differences created new roles. The Olympian order continued to develop, and Zeus's throne became more secure. But there was another dimension to his power. The ancient Greeks associated Zeus with the weather. This was one of the most visible signs of his authority. Clouds gathered, thunder rolled, lightning appeared, rain fell, storms moved across the mountains. To the ancient observer, these were not simply physical events. They were signs of divine activity. The sky seemed alive, and Zeus was its ruler. His thunderbolt became the ultimate symbol of divine power. It represented speed, force, and unpredictability. A lightning strike could appear without warning. It could destroy a tree, start a fire, terrify an entire community, and then disappear. The Greeks saw something similar in Zeus. He could be generous, but he could also act suddenly. His decisions could transform lives. The thunderbolt therefore became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of kingship itself. The king could act, the king could judge, the king could punish, but the king also had to maintain order. And Zeus had another responsibility. He had to deal with fate. The ancient Greeks believed that certain aspects of destiny were beyond even the gods. The fates were associated with the thread of life. One spun the thread, one measured it, one cut it. The exact relationship between Zeus and the fates varied across traditions. Sometimes, Zeus appeared to possess tremendous influence over destiny. Other traditions suggested that even Zeus could not simply erase what was destined to happen. This created a fascinating tension. If Zeus was the most powerful god, what could he not control? The answer was important. Even the king had limits, and those limits made the myths more meaningful. Because Zeus was not simply an all-powerful being who could solve every problem instantly. He could make mistakes. He could be deceived. He could face prophecies. He could lose people. He could be challenged. And he could suffer consequences. This made him more complex than a simple god of thunder. He was a ruler trying to maintain order in a universe filled with competing powers. His reign had begun with war. It had been secured through alliances, and now it depended upon balance. The balance between gods, the balance between gods and humans, the balance between freedom and authority, the balance between fate and choice, and the balance between power and responsibility. Zeus had learned from Cronus, but he had not become completely different from his father. He still feared threats. He still worried about succession. He still wanted to control the future. The difference was that Zeus often tried to manage those threats rather than simply destroy them. He created alliances. He negotiated. He punished. He rewarded. He watched. He waited. And sometimes, he interfered. His reign became the longest-lasting divine order in Greek mythology. The Olympians remained. Generation after generation, the stories continued. Heroes came and went. Kings rose and fell. Cities were built. Cities were destroyed. But Olympus remained above the mortal world. And Zeus remained upon his throne. The child hidden in Crete had become the father of gods and heroes. The prisoner of fate had become the ruler who judged others. The son who feared his father had become a father who feared prophecy. The warrior who fought for the throne had become a king responsible for protecting it. His story had come full circle. But there was still one final question. What would happen to Zeus's reign? Would the Olympians remain forever? Would another generation eventually challenge them? Would Zeus himself ever be replaced? Greek mythology never gives a simple ending. The stories were not designed to provide a single final chapter. Instead, they continued through countless generations. Zeus remained. His children remained. The heroes eventually became legends. The ancient cities disappeared. The temples became ruins. But the stories survived. People continued telling the story of the god who ruled the sky. They remembered his thunder. They remembered his lightning. They remembered his battles. They remembered his children. They remembered his anger. They remembered his love. And they remembered the strange journey that had brought him to the throne. A child hidden from his father. A young god who returned. A warrior who defeated the Titans. A king who established Olympus. A father who created heroes. A ruler who struggled to maintain order. And a god whose name would remain associated with the highest power of the ancient Greek world, Zeus. The king of Olympus, the lord of the sky, the bearer of the thunderbolt, the guardian of oaths, the protector of guests, the judge of kings, the father of gods and heroes. His reign had survived the ancient world, and although the temples would eventually fall silent, the stories would continue. Because mythology does not require a living temple. It requires only someone willing to tell the story again. And somewhere, beneath the quiet stars, the old mountain of Olympus still rises into the night. The clouds move slowly around its peaks. Lightning flashes beyond the distant horizon. And in the imagination of the ancient Greeks, a golden throne still waits beneath the storm clouds. The thunderbolt rests beside it. The king remains seated, watching the world below. And the story of Zeus continues. The story of Zeus began with fear. A father feared his children. A prophecy threatened his throne. A newborn child was hidden in the mountains of Crete. And from that hidden child came the god who would eventually rule Olympus. But the story did not end when Zeus won his throne. In many ways, that was when the most important part began. Because defeating Cronus was one thing, remaining king was another. Zeus had inherited a universe filled with ancient powers. He had inherited a family of gods. He had inherited a mortal world filled with uncertainty. And he had inherited the responsibility of keeping all of it together. For generations, the Greeks imagined Zeus sitting above the world. Not simply as a warrior, not simply as a god of storms, but as the highest authority among the Olympians. His throne represented order. His thunderbolt represented power. His position represented kingship. And his stories represented the complicated relationship between power and responsibility. Zeus had begun life as a vulnerable child. His father wanted him gone. His mother had hidden him. Others had protected him. He had grown in secret. Then he had returned. He had freed his brothers and sisters. He had gathered allies. He had defeated the Titans. He had defeated the giants. He had defeated Typhon. And eventually, he became the ruler of the divine world. But what made Zeus different from Cronus? That question lies at the center of his mythology. Cronus ruled because he was afraid. He believed that his children were threats. So he swallowed them. He tried to stop the future. Zeus knew this story. He had lived it. And because of that, he understood that absolute control could destroy a ruler. Zeus still feared prophecy. He still worried about threats. He still watched his children carefully. But instead of swallowing them, he allowed the divine family to grow. Athena became powerful. Apollo became powerful. Artemis became powerful. Hermes became powerful. Ares became powerful. Dionysus eventually became part of the Olympian world. Each god had an identity. Each had responsibilities. Each had followers among mortals. And Zeus remained above them as their king. This created something new, a divine society. The Olympians were not simply a collection of unrelated gods. They were a family, a complicated family. They argued, they competed, they loved, they hated, they made alliances, they betrayed one another, but they remained connected, and Zeus stood at the center. His authority could be challenged, but his throne remained. The Greeks could therefore imagine Olympus almost like a royal court. There was a king, there was a queen, there were princes and princesses. There were messengers, warriors, craftsmen, musicians, healers, hunters, and each played a role in the divine order. Zeus represented the highest level of authority, but he also represented something more ancient, the sky itself. To the people of ancient Greece, the sky was enormous. It was beyond human control. Clouds could gather without warning. Rain could save a harvest. A storm could destroy a ship. Lightning could strike the earth in an instant. Thunder could shake an entire mountain. The ancient Greeks looked upward and saw something powerful. They gave that power a name, Zeus. His connection with the sky made him one of the most important gods in the Greek religious world. He was not simply a character in stories. People worshipped him. They built temples to him. They sacrificed animals in his honor. They called upon him in prayers. Kings associated themselves with his authority. Travelers sought his protection. People who made oaths called upon Zeus as a witness. The god of the sky had become part of everyday religious life. And different communities honored him in different ways. One of the most famous centers of Zeus worship was Olympia. Olympia was not simply a place connected with athletic competition. It was also a major religious sanctuary. There stood an enormous temple dedicated to Zeus. Inside was one of the most famous statues of the ancient world, the statue of Zeus at Olympia. It was created by the sculptor Phidias. The statue was enormous. Zeus was represented seated upon a magnificent throne. He held symbols of his authority. The image was designed to communicate power, dignity, and divine majesty. Ancient writers considered the statue one of the greatest artistic achievements of the Greek world. The statue no longer exists. It was eventually destroyed, but its reputation survived. And the image tells us something important. The Greeks did not imagine Zeus simply as a frightening storm. They also imagined him as a king, calm, powerful, majestic, seated above the world. The thunderbolt was only one part of his identity. Another important symbol was the eagle. The eagle was associated with Zeus. It represented the heights of the sky. It could fly above mountains. It could look down upon the world. And because Zeus ruled from above, the eagle became a natural symbol of his power. The oak tree was also sacred to Zeus. At Dodona, one of the oldest prophetic sanctuaries associated with the god, people sought messages from the divine. The rustling of leaves, the sounds of nature, the interpretation of signs. The ancient Greeks believed that Zeus could communicate through the natural world, the sky, the trees, the thunder, the weather. Everything around them could become a reminder of divine presence. This reveals something important about ancient Greek religion. The gods were not always imagined as distant beings living in a completely separate universe. They were present in nature. A storm was not simply weather. It could be a message. A mountain was not simply rock. It could be sacred. A river was not simply water. It could possess a divine spirit. The world itself was filled with meaning, and Zeus stood above much of it. His authority also extended to human society. The ancient Greeks believed that kingship required divine approval. A king was expected to rule with justice. A ruler who abused power could lose divine favor. This idea appears repeatedly in Greek mythology. The gods watch, they judge, they punish, but they also reward. A person who respects sacred laws can receive protection. A person who violates them can suffer. This made Zeus an important symbol of justice. But again, the myths were not simple. Zeus himself could act unfairly. He could favor one person over another. He could become angry. He could be influenced by other gods. His decisions could sometimes appear inconsistent. The Greeks did not necessarily see this as a contradiction. They understood that mythology was not a perfect legal system. It was a collection of stories exploring the unpredictable nature of existence. And Zeus embodied that complexity. He could represent justice, and he could represent power. He could protect, and he could punish. He could create order, and his own actions could create chaos. That complexity is one reason his character survived for so long. Zeus was not perfect. He was enormous. He was powerful. He was immortal. But he still behaved in ways that reflected human emotions. Perhaps this made him easier to understand. The ancient Greeks could look at Zeus and recognize something familiar. A ruler who wanted respect. A father who worried about his children. A husband who could become jealous. A brother who argued with his family. A king who wanted to maintain control. The difference was scale. Zeus's decisions affected the universe. His anger could produce storms. His children could become heroes. His conflicts could lead to wars. His promises could shape kingdoms. His family drama could become mythology. And through all of it, Zeus remained at the center. His children continued the divine story. Athena represented wisdom and strategic thought. Apollo represented prophecy, music, healing, and light. Artemis represented the wilderness and the hunt. Hermes represented travel, communication, trade, and cleverness. Ares represented the violent side of war. Aphrodite represented love and desire. Hephaestus represented craftsmanship and the power of creation. Dionysus represented transformation, celebration, and altered states of consciousness. Together, they formed a divine world in which almost every aspect of human experience had a mythological counterpart, and Zeus stood above them. Not necessarily as the god responsible for every aspect of life, but as the highest authority, the king, the sky, the thunder, the oath, the law, the order. His mythology also connected him to some of the greatest heroes ever remembered: Perseus, Heracles, and through the wider divine family, countless other heroes became connected to Olympus. The heroes were mortal. They could die, but their stories could survive. This was one of the most important ideas in Greek mythology. Immortality could take different forms. The gods possessed immortal bodies. Humans could possess immortal names. A hero could die and still be remembered thousands of years later. Perseus died. Heracles died as a mortal, though later traditions placed him among the gods. Achilles died. Hector died. Odysseus eventually died. But their stories remained, and Zeus, as the father or divine ancestor of many heroes, became part of those stories. His influence extended through generations. The mythology of Greece, therefore, became an enormous family tree. Gods created heroes. Heroes founded kingdoms. Kingdoms created wars. Wars created legends. Legends became stories. And stories became traditions. Zeus stood near the center of that entire network. His name appears again and again, sometimes as the cause of an event, sometimes as its judge, sometimes as a protector, sometimes as an enemy, sometimes simply as the god watching from Olympus. His influence was enormous, but the world that worshipped him would eventually change. Greek civilization would rise, then change, then be absorbed into other cultures. The Romans would adopt many Greek gods into their own religious system. Zeus became Jupiter. The Roman Jupiter inherited many of the characteristics of Zeus: sky, thunder, kingship, authority. The name changed, the culture changed, but the basic image survived. The god of the sky, the divine king, the thunderbolt, the eagle, the ruler of the heavens. The story had crossed from one civilization into another, and eventually the ancient temples would decline. The old religious traditions would lose their central place. The temples would become ruins, statues would break, sacred places would become archaeological sites. But the stories did not disappear. They survived in literature, in art, in poetry, in theater, in philosophy, and eventually in modern popular culture. The name Zeus is still recognized around the world. People who may never have studied ancient Greek religion know the image: a powerful god, a thunderbolt in his hand, a throne in the heavens, a storm surrounding him. The image has survived because it is simple, but the real mythology is much more complicated. Zeus was not simply the strongest god. He was the result of a long transformation. He represented the victory of a new order over an older one. He was the child who survived, the son who returned, the brother who freed his family, the warrior who defeated the Titans, the ruler who organized Olympus, the father of heroes, the judge of gods and mortals, and the king who constantly had to protect the balance he had created. His story began with the fear of being replaced, and perhaps the most interesting part is that Zeus eventually became the very kind of ruler his father had feared: a powerful father, surrounded by powerful children, watching the future, wondering what might come next. But Zeus avoided the fate of Cronus. He did not allow fear to completely destroy his family. He allowed the next generation to exist. He allowed them to become powerful. And because of that, the world of Olympus continued. There was no final battle against Zeus, no single hero who replaced him, no child who simply walked into Olympus and took his throne. The myths remained open. Zeus remained king, and perhaps that was the point. The story was not about a ruler who eventually disappeared. It was about the establishment of order, a world where the gods had their domains. The mortals had their lives, the heroes had their destinies, and the sky had its king, Zeus. The thunder rolled, the clouds moved across the mountains, rain fell upon the earth. The rivers continued toward the sea, the forests grew, human cities rose and eventually disappeared. Generations came and went, but above them all, the sky remained. And that may be why Zeus became such a powerful symbol. The sky was always there. Every human being could look upward and see it. The same sky watched over kings and farmers, warriors and poets, children and old people, the rich and the poor, the living and the dying. The sky belonged to everyone, and Zeus, as its divine ruler, became one of the most universal figures in Greek mythology. His story was never truly about one mountain, or one throne, or one thunderbolt. It was about humanity trying to understand the forces above them, the storms they could not control, the future they could not see, the power they could not understand, the order they hoped existed behind the chaos, and perhaps most importantly, the desire to believe that somewhere above the uncertainty of life, there was a force watching over the world. For the ancient Greeks, that force could be imagined as Zeus, a god who could hear an oath, see an injustice, send rain, call the thunder, protect a stranger, punish a king, and sit upon the highest throne of the divine world. The story began with a child hiding in darkness. It ended with a king standing beneath the open sky. Between those two moments was an entire universe of stories. Cronus, Rhea, the Titans, the Titanomachy, Olympus, the giants, Typhon, Prometheus, Fire, Pandora, Perseus, Heracles, Athena, Achilles, Troy, and the countless gods and heroes who became part of the world Zeus ruled. Every story added another layer. Every generation remembered him differently. But the central image remained: the thunderbolt, the eagle, the oak, the mountain, the throne, the sky, and the king, Zeus. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside his mythology is that power is never simply about possessing a throne. Power is about what happens after you sit upon it. Cronus possessed the throne, but fear destroyed him. Zeus possessed the throne, and he spent his reign trying to maintain the balance of the universe. He did not always succeed. He was not always fair. He was not always wise. But he remained, and his stories survived, long after the temples became silent, long after the statues disappeared, long after the people who once prayed to him were gone. The name remained: Zeus, king of the gods, lord of the sky, bearer of the thunderbolt, father of gods and heroes. And somewhere in the imagination of the ancient world, he still sits upon his throne. The clouds drift slowly around Mount Olympus. The distant mountains disappear into the mist. A faint glow rests upon the marble. The thunderbolt lies beside the throne. The eagle remains nearby. Nothing moves except the clouds. Nothing changes except the light. The king watches. The world below continues. Human beings live their short lives. They build. They love. They fight. They dream. They lose. They hope. And then they disappear. But the stories remain. The stories are passed from one generation to another. A father tells his child. A poet writes them down. A teacher explains them. A traveler remembers them. A reader discovers them thousands of years later. And each time the story is told, Zeus returns, not as a living god, not as a ruler demanding worship, but as a figure in one of humanity's oldest attempts to understand the universe. A child who survived, a god who conquered, a king who ruled, a father who created heroes, a figure who embodied both order and chaos, and a name that became almost inseparable from the ancient Greek imagination. The storm slowly passes. The clouds open. The night sky becomes quiet. The mountain remains, and for a final moment, there is only silence. The story of Zeus has reached its end. But mythology has no true ending, because stories survive their storytellers. And as long as people continue looking toward the sky, the old king of Olympus will never completely disappear. Zeus remains there in the thunder, in the lightning, in the ancient stones, in the broken temples, in the statues that once stood beneath the sun, in the poems that survived the centuries. and in the imagination of everyone who hears his name, Zeus, the king of the gods, the ruler of Olympus, the lord of the sky, and one of the greatest figures ever created by the ancient world. His throne may exist only in mythology now. His temples may be ruins, his statue may be gone, but his story remains, and the sky above us still stretches endlessly into the distance, just as it did when the ancient Greeks first looked upward and imagined a god sitting among the clouds.